In 1066, England was forever changed by the Battle of Hastings, a decisive conflict that saw William the Conqueror defeat the English King Harold II and claim the English crown. The rolling hills around Hastings were stained with blood as the Norman invaders clashed with the Saxon defenders in one of the most important battles in medieval history. But long after the swords were sheathed and the dead were buried, whispers of ghostly warriors, spectral armies, and strange lights have echoed through the region. Hastings, it is said, is haunted not just by the memories of the battle, but by the restless souls of those who fell in the fields and forests surrounding the town. Visitors to the battle site have long reported eerie sightings, shadows that move on their own, ghostly figures in armor marching silently through the mist, and the sound of distant battle cries carried on the wind. As the centuries passed, these stories grew into legends, deeply entwined with the local folklore of Hastings. Join us as we explore 4 chilling tales of the supernatural surrounding the Norman invasion tales that suggest the battle for England's throne may still be raging in the afterlife. Story 1. The Phantom Charge of Senlac Hill. Senlac Hill, the location where the infamous Battle of Hastings unfolded on October 14, 1066, is hallowed ground, soaked in the blood of Anglo-Saxon warriors and Norman invaders alike. It was on this steep rise that King Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, made his final stand against William the Conqueror. The clash that unfolded here changed the course of English history, as the Saxon forces, exhausted and outnumbered, were defeated after a grueling day of battle. But Senlac Hill's story did not end with the Norman victory. For centuries, locals have spoken of strange occurrences on this quiet hilltop, particularly as night falls. Phantom armies are said to march across the fields, spectral figures in armor charge into battle, and eerie sounds of clashing swords and dying cries echo through the air, even on nights when the land is perfectly still. One of the most enduring stories surrounding Senlac Hill is that of a ghostly army seen charging down its slope at dusk. For centuries, the tale has been passed down, and while many dismiss it as folklore, others, like farmer Thomas Barnes, know all too well that these apparitions are real. Thomas Barnes was a practical man, a farmer in the village of Battle, which lay near the infamous hill. He had lived there his whole life, working the same fields that his father and grandfather had before him. Like most men of his time, he was skeptical of ghost stories. He had heard the legends about Senlac Hill, but he didn't believe in them. Ghosts and phantom armies were stories for children, not something that had any place in the real world. It was autumn 1890 when Thomas had his encounter. The summer harvest had been delayed that year due to unseasonably bad weather, and Thomas found himself working late into the evening to finish gathering his crops before the winter set in. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in long shadows, but Thomas was determined to finish the day's work. The air was crisp, with a biting chill that hinted at the coming frost. As he loaded the last of the day's harvest into his cart, Thomas heard a distant rumble. At first, he thought it was thunder, a storm rolling in from the coast. Perhaps, but when he looked up, the sky was clear, the stars just beginning to twinkle in the deep blue of twilight. The sound grew louder, echoing across the valley, and Thomas realized it wasn't thunder at all. It was the unmistakable sound of hooves, hundreds of them pounding against the earth. Confused, Thomas glanced toward Senlac Hill, squinting into the growing darkness. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what looked like an entire army charging down the hill. Hundreds of men on horseback, their armor gleaming faintly in the moonlight, their banners whipping in the wind. The sight was impossible, yet there it was before him. The hairs on the back of Thomas's neck stood up as he watched the phantom army race toward the valley. The sound of their hooves grew deafening, and the air seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. Thomas's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This was the site of the Battle of Hastings. Could it be that he was witnessing some strange spectral reenactment of that long-ago day? He stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the scene before him. The ghostly soldiers were drawing closer, and as they did, Thomas could make out more details: the glint of swords, the rippling of chainmail, the grim expressions on the faces of the men. They were charging toward an enemy that wasn't there. their expressions locked in fierce determination. And then, just as they reached the base of the hill, the army vanished. The thunder of hooves fell silent, the ghostly figures dissolved into the night air, and the only sound left was the whisper of the wind through the grass. Thomas stood there for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. When he finally regained his senses, he hurried home, not daring to look back at the hill. In the days that followed, Thomas tried to forget about what he had seen. He told himself it must have been a trick of the light, or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him after a long day of work. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the memory of the ghostly army, the way they had charged down the hill with such intensity, only to disappear as if they had never been there at all. Word of Thomas's sighting quickly spread through the village, and though many of his neighbors scoffed at the idea of ghostly soldiers, there were a few who believed him. Old Mrs. Fletcher, the widow who lived on the edge of the village, claimed to have seen the same thing many years before, when she had been a young girl walking home after sunset. Others spoke of hearing strange noises on the hill at night, the sound of marching feet, the clash of swords, and the distant cries of men in battle. Despite the growing number of stories, most of the villagers remained skeptical. Life went on as usual in battle, and Senlac Hill remained a quiet, windswept landmark, a place where history had been made, but nothing more. Yet for Thomas, the experience lingered, haunting his thoughts. A few weeks after his first encounter, Thomas found himself working late again, this time repairing a section of his fence that had been damaged in a storm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt a familiar chill in the air. His eyes were drawn, almost involuntarily, to Senlac Hill. There, in the fading light, he saw them again. The same ghostly army, charging down the hill as they had before. The same thunderous roar of hooves, the same spectral figures in armor, their swords raised high. This time, however, there was something different. The soldiers' faces were clearer now, their features more distinct. Thomas could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the grim determination etched into their faces. They were fighting not just for victory, but for survival. Once again, the army vanished as they reached the base of the hill, leaving Thomas standing alone in the gathering darkness. The second sighting shook Thomas to his core. He had seen the ghostly army not once, but twice, and the clarity of the second encounter left no room for doubt in his mind. These were not figments of his imagination. The spirits of the soldiers who had fought and died at Hastings were still there, trapped in an endless loop, reliving their final moments over and over again. Thomas tried to avoid Senlac Hill after that, but it was nearly impossible. His farm was located just a mile from the battlefield, and the hill loomed large on the horizon, a constant reminder of the strange events he had witnessed. He began to dread the sight of it, especially at dusk, when the shadows grew long and the air turned cold. One evening, as he was walking home from the village, Thomas found himself once again near the base of the hill. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep indigo, the first stars beginning to twinkle above. Thomas quickened his pace, eager to put as much distance between himself and the hill as possible. But as he passed the foot of the slope, he heard it again, the distant rumble of hooves. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced up, expecting to see the ghostly army charging down the hill once more. But this time, there was something different. The rumble was louder, more intense, and it was coming from directly behind him. Thomas whirled around, his pulse racing. There, not 20 feet away, was a single rider on horseback, galloping toward him at breakneck speed. The rider's armor gleamed in the moonlight, and his face was twisted in an expression of fierce concentration. For a brief moment, Thomas was frozen in place, unable to move as the rider bore down on him. The sound of hooves grew deafening, and he could feel the ground trembling beneath his feet. And then, just as the rider was about to reach him, he vanished. The air fell silent, and the only sound left was the rapid thumping of Thomas's heart. He stood there for several minutes, struggling to catch his breath, his mind racing. The ghostly army had never come so close before. Why had the rider singled him out this time? Was it a warning? A sign? Shaken, Thomas hurried home, vowing never to come near Senlac Hill again. By 1900, Word of Thomas Barnes's encounters with the Phantom Army had spread beyond the village of Battle, attracting the attention of historians and paranormal investigators alike. One such historian, a man named Robert Finch, became particularly fascinated by the stories. Finch had long been interested in the Battle of Hastings and the supernatural legends that had sprung up around it, and he was determined to investigate the claims for himself. Finch arrived in Battle in the spring of that year, eager to explore Senlac Hill and speak with Thomas Barnes. He found the farmer to be a quiet, serious man, not given to flights of fancy. Thomas recounted his experiences in detail, describing the ghostly army with a clarity that left no doubt in Finch's mind that he was telling the truth. Determined to see the apparitions for himself, Finch spent several nights camped near Senlac Hill, watching and waiting for any sign of the Phantom Army. For days, nothing happened. The hill remained quiet, the fields empty. But on the fifth night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Finch heard the same distant rumble that Thomas had described. His heart raced as he stood at the edge of the hill, his eyes scanning the horizon. And then he saw them. The ghostly army appeared, charging down the slope with terrifying speed, their armor gleaming in the moonlight. Finch's breath caught in his throat as he watched them race past him, their faces locked in expressions of desperation and fury. For what felt like hours, Finch stood there, watching the phantom soldiers reenact their final moments. And then, just as Thomas had described, the army vanished, leaving Finch standing alone in the eerie silence of the night. Shaken but exhilarated, Finch returned to London, where he wrote extensively about his experience. His account of the ghostly army of Senlac Hill became one of the most well-known stories of paranormal activity in England, and it cemented the legend of the phantom soldiers in the public imagination. Years passed, and the stories of the ghostly army continued to circulate. Many claimed to have seen the phantom soldiers charging down Senlac Hill, but few had ever come as close as Thomas Barnes. By the time he was an old man, Thomas had long since given up hope of understanding the strange events he had witnessed. But in the winter of 1925, just before his death, Thomas had one final encounter with the spirits of Senlac Hill. It was a bitterly cold night, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of frost. Thomas had been ill for several weeks, confined to his bed, but on this particular night, he felt a strange urge to go outside. Despite his frail condition, he bundled himself up and made his way to the edge of his farm, where he could see the silhouette of Senlac Hill in the distance. As he stood there, the wind howling through the trees, Thomas heard it once more, the familiar sound of hooves pounding against the earth. His heart raced as he turned toward the hill, and there in the moonlight, he saw the ghostly army for the last time. This time, however, something was different. The soldiers were not charging into battle. Instead, they were marching in formation, their swords lowered, their expressions somber. They passed by Thomas in silence, their figures flickering like shadows in the cold night air. And then, at the rear of the army, Thomas saw him, the rider who had nearly run him down all those years ago. The man was still dressed in armor, but his face was no longer twisted in fury. Instead, he looked at Thomas with an expression of sadness and regret. For a brief moment, the two men locked eyes, and Thomas felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The rider nodded once, and then he too vanished, leaving Thomas standing alone in the frosty night. Thomas Barnes passed away not long after that final encounter, but his story has lived on, passed down through generations of villagers and historians alike. The legend of the Phantom Army of Senlac Hill remains one of the most enduring tales of the supernatural in England, a reminder that the echoes of the past can still be heard, and that the spirits of those who fought and died for their land may never truly rest. To this day, visitors to Senlac Hill have reported seeing the ghostly soldiers, their armor glinting in the moonlight as they charge into battle once more. The Battle of Hastings may have ended nearly 1,000 years ago, but for the spirits of Senlac Hill, the fight continues endlessly, replaying the final moments of their lives. The next time you stand at the base of Senlac Hill, listen closely. You might just hear the distant rumble of hooves and the clash of swords as the ghostly army charges once more, forever trapped in the shadows of history. Story 2. the whispering winds of the Blood Moor. The Blood Moor, located just beyond Senlac Hill, was once a place of quiet marshland, but after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, it became a site of dark legend. This land, according to local stories, was where many of the dead and wounded soldiers from both sides were abandoned, their bodies swallowed by the marsh, never to be properly buried. The waters of the moor soaked up their blood, and the cries of the dying became part of the wind that still sweeps across the barren landscape. Over the centuries, the Blood Moor has earned its grim name. People who have ventured onto the moor after dusk speak of strange voices carried on the wind, whispers of men calling out in anguish, their final words scattered to the breeze. Some have claimed to hear the clash of swords, the shouts of commanders ordering troops into battle, or the groaning of the wounded, as if the land itself remembers the carnage of that terrible day. Few dare to walk the moor at night, but those who do tell stories of unseen presences, of cold fingers brushing against their skin, and of the unnerving sensation that they are not alone. These experiences are often dismissed as the overactive imaginations of locals and tourists alike. However, one such tale, which took place in 1973, has been difficult to dismiss. The woman who experienced the terror of the Blood Moor firsthand was Eleanor Howard, a historian determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. What she encountered during her investigation was far more than she could have ever expected. Eleanor Howard was not a woman prone to superstition. As a historian specializing in medieval England, she had dedicated her career to unraveling the facts behind myths and legends. In the early 1970s, she had become intrigued by the folklore surrounding the Battle of Hastings, particularly the stories of hauntings in the surrounding countryside. Hastings was a battlefield, and like any such place, it was bound to inspire tales of restless spirits. Yet one particular story caught her attention more than the others: the whispers on the Blood Moor. The more she read about the Blood Moor, the more fascinated she became. Many of the accounts were vague, often second-hand stories of distant voices or strange sensations, but they shared enough similarities to suggest that something unusual was happening there. The fact that the whispers were often reported to occur at night when the winds swept over the marshy land made Eleanor wonder whether there was some natural explanation for the phenomenon, perhaps an acoustic anomaly caused by the landscape or the waterlogged ground. Determined to explore the moor herself, Eleanor made plans to visit Hastings in the fall of 1973, when the air would be cool and the moor would be at its most atmospheric. She would spend several days camping near the moor, using the opportunity to both investigate the site and conduct research in nearby historical archives. Her colleagues thought she was wasting her time. "It's just a story," one of them had said, shaking his head when she mentioned her trip. "You're a historian, Eleanor, not a ghost hunter." But Eleanor had always been drawn to the places where history and legend met. She didn't expect to find ghosts, but she did hope to find answers. And so, armed with her notebooks, her camera, and a recorder, she set off for the Blood Moor, eager to see what, if anything, was truly there. The first day of her trip was uneventful. Eleanor spent the morning visiting the site of the Battle of Hastings, walking the grounds of Senlac Hill and imagining the chaos that had unfolded there nearly 1,000 years earlier. As she stood at the top of the hill, she could almost hear the clang of swords, the cries of soldiers, and the thunder of horses' hooves. The air was crisp and cold, and a light mist hung over the fields, lending the place an eerie, timeless quality. That evening, Eleanor set up her tent near the Blood Moor, just outside the marshes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, and a chill crept into the air as the wind picked up. She had chosen her campsite carefully, far enough from the moor to avoid the damp ground, but close enough that she could observe it easily. As darkness fell, the landscape around her became eerily still. The wind, which had been gusting throughout the day, died down, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The moor, shrouded in mist, seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, its surface still and black under the night sky. Eleanor sat outside her tent, listening to the quiet. She had expected the wind to play a role in the phenomenon, but tonight there was none. The only sound was the occasional rustle of grass as a breeze whispered across the moor. She felt a creeping sense of anticipation, as though something was watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. She switched on her recorder and began speaking softly into it, noting the conditions of the night, her location, and the history of the area. She spoke of the legends surrounding the moor, of the stories she had heard about the whispers in the wind. As she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she knew she was alone. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The moor remained quiet, the mist undisturbed. Eleanor's rational mind told her that the stories were just that, stories. But as the night wore on, her nerves began to fray. Every small sound, every movement of the mist seemed pregnant with meaning. It wasn't until after midnight, when she was just about to retire to her tent, that she heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, carried on the breeze. Eleanor froze, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to hear more. The whisper came again, soft and indistinct, as though someone was speaking from far away. She turned her head, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her pulse quickened as she reached for her recorder, turning up the volume in hopes of capturing the sound. The whisper came again, and this time she was certain it was a voice, but the words were too soft, too garbled to understand. Eleanor stood up, her eyes scanning the dark landscape. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The whispering stopped. The next morning, Eleanor reviewed the recording, hoping that the whispers she had heard were captured. To her disappointment, the audio was nearly silent. Only the faintest hint of the whisper could be heard, a soft hiss that could easily have been dismissed as static or wind noise. Frustrated but undeterred, Eleanor decided to stay another night on the moor, convinced that something strange was indeed happening. As the sun set on the second day, Eleanor prepared herself for what she hoped would be a more eventful night. She set up her equipment, placed her recorder in a more prominent position, and made sure her camera was ready. This time she would not be caught off guard. The evening began much like the one before, with the wind dying down as darkness fell and the moor growing eerily still. The mist returned, thicker than the night before, curling around the edges of the marsh like a living thing. Eleanor sat outside her tent, her eyes fixed on the horizon, listening for any sign of the whispers. For hours, there was nothing. Then, shortly after midnight, the wind picked up again, and with it came the voices. This time, the whispers were louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, carried on the wind that swept across the moor. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she turned up the volume on her recorder, straining to make out the words. But the voices were still too faint, their words garbled and indistinct. She closed her eyes, focusing all her attention on the sounds. There were multiple voices now, dozens, maybe even hundreds, overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of murmurs. Some were low and guttural, others high-pitched and frantic. And though she couldn't understand what they were saying, she could feel the desperation in their tone. They were pleading. Eleanor's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, filling the air around her. The wind had picked up, and with it came a chill that seeped into her bones. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around her like a shroud, and the sense of unease that had been gnawing at her since her arrival intensified. She stood up, her hands shaking as she reached for her camera. The whispers were almost deafening now, a chorus of voices rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern, as though they were calling out to her, beckoning her closer to the moor. Suddenly, one voice broke through the cacophony, clear and distinct. "Help me!" Eleanor gasped, her heart lurching in her chest. The voice was male, rough and strained, as though the speaker were in pain. It was so clear, so real, that for a moment she thought someone must be standing right behind her. She whirled around, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispers continued, swirling around her in a dizzying spiral, the wind howling through the marsh like a living thing. The words were becoming clearer now, snippets of conversation floating through the air. Eleanor heard men calling out for help, groaning in pain, and shouting commands in a language she didn't fully understand. Old English, perhaps, or Norman French. The wind grew stronger, whipping her hair around her face and pulling at her clothes. The mist was so thick now that she could barely see more than a few feet in front of her. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to step onto the moor, to follow the voices that were calling to her. Her rational mind screamed at her to stay back, to retreat to the safety of her tent. But something else, a deeper, more primal instinct, urged her forward. She took a step toward the moor. As Eleanor stepped onto the moor, the ground squelched beneath her feet, the waterlogged earth clinging to her boots. The whispers were louder now, almost overwhelming, their voices rising and falling in a frantic, desperate chorus. She could feel the presence of someone just out of sight, lurking in the mist, watching her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved deeper into the marsh. The air was freezing, and every breath she took felt like ice in her lungs. The whispers seemed to surround her, pressing in from all sides, and she could feel the weight of their anguish. "Help us," one voice pleaded. "We're lost," another cried. Eleanor's hands shook as she fumbled with her camera, trying to capture the swirling mist around her. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the ground, but there was nothing to see, no figures, no shapes, just the endless expanse of mist and darkness. And yet she could feel them. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits were growing impatient. She could hear the groaning of the wounded, the shuffling of feet, and the soft, wet sound of bodies sinking into the marsh. The wind howled through the moor, carrying with it the stench of decay. Eleanor gagged as the smell of rot and death filled her nostrils, so strong it made her eyes water. She stumbled, her boots sinking into the mud, and as she struggled to pull herself free, she felt it cold, clammy fingers brushing against her ankle. She let out a gasp, her body tensing in fear. For a moment she stood frozen, too terrified to move. The fingers tightened their grip, pulling her deeper into the mud. Panic surged through her, and she kicked out, breaking free from the invisible grasp. Staggering back, Eleanor's heart raced as she turned and ran, her boots splashing through the waterlogged ground. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more desperate with each step. "Don't leave us," one voice cried. "Come back," another pleaded. But Eleanor didn't stop. She ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the mist closed in around her. The voices seemed to chase her, their cries echoing through the darkness, but she didn't dare look back. When she finally reached her tent, she collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with fear. The whispers had stopped, and the wind had died down, leaving the night eerily quiet. The mist still clung to the moor, but it no longer felt alive, no longer held the same malevolent presence. Eleanor lay there for several minutes, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had come to the Bloodmoor seeking answers, but instead she had found something far more terrifying, something she couldn't explain. The following morning, Eleanor packed up her campsite, eager to leave the moor behind. But as she drove back to her hotel, the events of the previous night played over and over in her mind. The whispers, the cold fingers, the overwhelming sense of dread, it had all been so real, so tangible. When she arrived at the hotel, she immediately sat down to review the recordings from the night before. She played the audio from her recorder, her heart pounding as she listened. At first there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the occasional rustle of grass. But then faintly, she heard it. The whispering. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened to the voices, indistinct at first, but growing louder as the recording continued. She could hear the same desperate pleas she had heard the night before, the same cries for help, and then, clear as day, the voice she had heard so vividly in the mist. "Help me." Eleanor's hands trembled as she rewound the recording, playing it back again and again. The voice was unmistakable. She hadn't imagined it. The whispers were real. She spent the next several hours listening to the recordings, trying to make sense of what she had captured. Some of the voices spoke in English, but others spoke in a language she couldn't understand, perhaps Old English, or the Norman French spoken by William the Conqueror's men. The more she listened, the more she became convinced that the voices were those of the soldiers who had died on the moor during the battle. Their spirits trapped in the marsh, unable to move on. But why? Why were they still here, centuries after the battle had ended? And what had they meant by "help us"? Eleanor didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. she had uncovered something far darker and more unsettling than she had ever anticipated. Despite her fear, Eleanor couldn't leave Hastings without one final attempt to uncover the truth. On the third and final night of her stay, she returned to the Blood Moor, determined to confront the whispers once and for all. This time, she brought more equipment, extra recorders, cameras, and even an old lantern that she hoped would help guide her through the mist. As she approached the moor, the wind picked up again, and the mist rolled in, just as it had the previous nights. Eleanor set up her equipment, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. She had come to find answers, and tonight she would not run. The whispers began almost immediately. They were louder than before, more urgent, as though the spirits knew this was their last chance to be heard. Eleanor stood at the edge of the moor, listening intently, her breath visible in the cold night air. The voices were all around her now, calling out in desperation. "Help us! We're trapped! We can't leave!" Eleanor's hands shook as she raised her lantern, stepping cautiously onto the moor. The mist swirled around her, thick and suffocating, but she pressed on, her boots sinking into the soft ground. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the spirits were closing in on her, surrounding her. "Help me!" The same voice she had heard the previous night cut through the cacophony, clear and insistent. Eleanor stopped, her heart racing as she turned toward the sound. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" For a moment, the whispers fell silent, and then from the depths of the mist, a figure emerged. It was faint, barely more than a shadow, but it was there a man, dressed in the tattered remnants of a soldier's uniform, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, hollow and desperate, locked onto hers, and in that moment, Eleanor understood. He was one of the many who had died on the moor, his body lost to the marsh, his soul trapped here for all eternity. He and the others were searching for a way out, for someone to help them find peace. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I don't know how to help you." The figure reached out toward her, his hand hovering just inches from her own. For a brief moment, she thought he would touch her, but then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished, dissolving into the mist. The whispers faded, the wind died down, and the moor fell silent once more. Eleanor left Hastings the following morning, her mind heavy with the weight of what she had experienced. She had come to the Blood Moor seeking answers, but instead, she had found only more questions. The spirits of the soldiers who had died there were still trapped, their voices carried on the wind, pleading for help that she could not give. Though she returned to her work as a historian, Eleanor was never able to shake the memories of those nights on the Blood Moor. The recordings she had captured were the only proof of what she had experienced, and even they were faint, incomplete, just whispers in the wind. But for Eleanor, they were enough. She had heard the voices of the dead, and she knew that the Blood Moor was a place where history lingered, where the past and present blurred together in the mist. The legend of the Blood Moor lives on, passed down through generations of locals and visitors alike. Some say that the voices still call out on windy nights, carried across the moor on the whispering winds. Others claim to have seen the same shadowy figures Eleanor saw, their faces filled with sorrow, their hands reaching out for help. And perhaps, if you stand on the edge of the moor at dusk, when the mist begins to rise and the wind whispers through the reeds, you'll hear them too, the voices of the lost souls, still waiting for someone to help them find their way home. The Blood Moor remains a place of quiet, haunting beauty, a landscape forever marked by the tragedy of the Battle of Hastings. The whispers that drift across the marshes are a reminder that history is never truly gone, that the echoes of the past can still be heard if you listen closely enough. For Eleanor Howard, the whispers of the Blood Moor were more than just a legend. They were the voices of the forgotten, the lost, and the trapped, calling out across the centuries for someone to hear them. And perhaps one day, someone will. Story 3. The Wraith of Battle Abbey. Battle Abbey, standing stoically on the site where the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066, was built as an act of penance by William the Conqueror. After his victory over King Harold II, William vowed to build the abbey in memory of the men who had died on that blood-soaked field. For centuries, it has been a place of reflection, a reminder of the violence and loss that shaped England's history. But beneath its tranquil facade, Battle Abbey harbors dark secrets. Stories of ghostly apparitions have haunted its stone halls for centuries. The most terrifying of these stories is that of the Wraith of Battle Abbey, a ghostly figure, tall and cloaked, that has been seen wandering the grounds at night. Witnesses have described the Wraith as a silent, menacing presence, its face hidden beneath a hood, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The Wraith is said to be the spirit of a Norman knight, one of William's soldiers who fell in the battle. According to legend, he was not buried with honor, his soul left to wander the earth in search of redemption. The monks who once lived at the abbey believed the Wraith to be cursed, a restless spirit bound to the place where he died. Over the centuries, the Wraith has been seen by monks, soldiers, and visitors alike, always appearing at the darkest hour of night. The most famous encounter with the Wraith occurred in 1936, when a groundskeeper named Alfred Moore came face to face with the ghostly figure. Alfred Moore had been the groundskeeper at Battle Abbey for nearly 10 years. He was a simple man, content with his life tending the abbey's gardens and maintaining its historic structures. He had grown accustomed to the quiet beauty of the abbey, its stone walls steeped in history, its grounds serene and undisturbed. Like many who worked at the abbey, Alfred had heard the stories of the Wraith. The other groundskeepers spoke of strange sights and sounds at night, shadows that moved on their own, footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and a cold, unnatural presence that seemed to watch from the dark corners of the abbey. But Alfred had never believed in ghosts. He was a practical man, and he dismissed the stories as fanciful tales meant to scare visitors and new employees. That all changed one cold winter night. It was late December, and Alfred had stayed behind at the abbey to finish repairing a section of the stone wall that had crumbled in a recent storm. The sun had long since set, and the abbey was shrouded in darkness, its stone towers casting long shadows across the grounds. A thick fog had rolled in from the surrounding countryside, clinging to the abbey like a spectral shroud. As Alfred packed up his tools and prepared to leave, he noticed something strange. A figure standing near the ruins of the old chapel, its form barely visible through the mist. At first, he thought it was one of the other groundskeepers, perhaps checking on something before heading home. But as he watched, the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, facing the ruined chapel, its back to Alfred. A chill crept down Alfred's spine. Something about the figure was wrong. It was too tall, too still, as if it weren't quite real. He hesitated, his hand gripping the handle of his tool bag, unsure of what to do. "Who's there?" Alfred called out, his voice trembling slightly. The figure remained motionless. A deep sense of unease washed over him. There was something unsettling about the way the figure stood, its posture rigid, its head slightly bowed. Alfred took a step forward, his boots crunching softly on the frosty grass. As he approached, the figure began to take on more definition. It was dressed in a long, dark cloak, the hood pulled up to obscure its face. The cloak billowed slightly in the wind, but the figure itself did not move. It seemed to hover just above the ground, its feet hidden beneath the folds of the cloak. Alfred stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" he called again, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure slowly turned its head. Alfred gasped, stumbling back as the figure's face came into view. It was pale, almost skeletal, its skin stretched tightly over its hollow cheeks. But it was the eyes that terrified him the most. They were glowing, two pinpricks of fiery light that burned with an intensity that made Alfred's blood run cold. The Wraith of Battle Abbey had found him. For what felt like an eternity, Alfred stood frozen, his heart thundering in his chest as he stared into the Wraith's glowing eyes. The figure remained perfectly still, its cloak billowing softly in the wind, its face locked in a grim expression. Alfred could feel the cold radiating from the Wraith, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. He wanted to run, to flee from the Wraith's terrible gaze, but his legs refused to move. The Wraith took a step forward, its feet making no sound as they touched the frost-covered grass. It glided toward him, its eyes fixed on his, its face emotionless and pale. Alfred's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the Wraith drew closer, He could hear the faint rustle of its cloak as it moved, could feel the cold air swirling around him as the wraith's presence grew stronger. It was as if the very air around him had become heavy, pressing down on him with a weight he couldn't escape. The wraith was only a few feet away now, and Alfred could see the details of its face more clearly. The hollow eyes, the gaunt cheeks, the thin, bloodless lips. It was a face that had once been human, but now was something else, something far more terrifying. With a surge of terror, Alfred broke free of his paralysis. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a stone, and he fell to the ground with a cry of fear. The wraith paused, its head tilting slightly as it watched him struggle to stand. Alfred scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he turned and fled, his boots slipping on the frost as he ran. The wraith did not follow, but Alfred could feel its gaze on him, burning into his back as he sprinted across the abbey grounds. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the gatehouse, where he collapsed, gasping for breath. For the rest of his life, Alfred never forgot the face of the wraith, the glowing eyes, the terrible cold, and the sense of pure malice that had radiated from the ghostly figure. Though he continued to work at the abbey, he avoided the ruins of the old chapel at all costs, and he never ventured onto the grounds at night again. But Alfred was not the last to encounter the wraith. Decades later, in the 1970s, another sighting of the wraith would shake the quiet town of Battle. This time, the encounter took place in one of the abbey's old towers, where a group of archaeologists had been working to uncover more of the site's hidden history. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Rebecca Clark, was a no-nonsense academic with a keen interest in medieval architecture. She had spent years studying the history of Battle Abbey and had come to the site in hopes of discovering more about its early construction and the lives of the monks who had once lived there. Like Alfred Moore before her, Rebecca had heard the stories of the wraith, but she dismissed them as mere superstition. Ghosts were not real, she told herself. They were the product of overactive imaginations and centuries of storytelling. She was here to uncover history, not to indulge in folklore. But one night, as she worked late in the old tower, she would come to question everything she had believed. It was a cold evening in November, and the abbey grounds were quiet. The rest of the team had already left for the night, but Rebecca had stayed behind to finish cataloging some of the artifacts they had uncovered earlier in the day. The tower was drafty, the wind howling through the cracks in the stone walls, but Rebecca didn't mind. She enjoyed the solitude, the peace that came with working alone. As she bent over her notes, the wind outside seemed to grow stronger, rattling the shutters and causing the candles to flicker. Rebecca glanced up, frowning. The air had grown noticeably colder, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the chill. That's when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound like the rustling of fabric or the whisper of footsteps on stone. It came from the stairwell that led up to the tower's upper chamber, a place that had been sealed off for years due to safety concerns. No one had been up there in decades, and the stairs were crumbling and unsafe. Rebecca froze, her pen hovering above the paper as she listened. The sound came again closer this time, a soft, shuffling noise, like someone or something moving slowly down the stairs. Her heart began to race, her mind racing with possibilities. Had one of her team members returned without her noticing? Was it the wind playing tricks on her ears? Or was it something else, something far more sinister? The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the narrow stone stairwell. They were slow, deliberate, as though whatever was coming down the stairs was in no hurry. Rebecca stood up, her hands trembling as she backed away from the table. She glanced toward the door, her mind screaming at her to leave, to run, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. And then, from the shadows of the stairwell, it emerged, the wraith. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as the wraith stepped into the flickering candlelight. It was just as the legends described, tall, cloaked in a dark, tattered robe, its face hidden beneath a hood. But unlike Alfred's encounter, the wraith's eyes were not glowing with fire. Instead, they were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light around them. For a long, terrible moment, the wraith stood at the base of the stairs, its hooded face turned toward Rebecca. She could feel the weight of its gaze, though she could not see its eyes. The air in the tower grew colder still, and Rebecca shivered as the temperature dropped to near freezing. The wraith took a step forward, its cloak brushing the stone floor with a soft, rustling sound. Its movement was slow, almost graceful, but there was a menace in the way it moved, a predatory stillness that made Rebecca's blood run cold. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear. Every instinct told her to run, to get out of the tower, but her legs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. The wraith took another step forward, its form flickering like a shadow in the dim light. It raised one skeletal hand, pointing directly at Rebecca. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with an unspoken command. Rebecca's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the wraith closed the distance between them. She could feel its cold presence pressing against her, suffocating her, freezing her to the core. And yet, she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She could only stand there, trapped in the wraith's gaze. For a moment, she thought she saw something beneath the hood, a glimpse of pale skin, a flash of teeth, but then the wraith vanished, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The tower was silent once more. After that night, Rebecca was never the same. The encounter with the wraith had shaken her to her core, and she found it impossible to continue her work at the Abbey without feeling the wraith's cold presence looming over her. Every time she entered the tower, she could sense it watching her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself once again. The other members of the archaeological team noticed the change in her demeanor. She became withdrawn, nervous, always looking over her shoulder as though expecting to see the wraith emerge from the shadows at any moment. She refused to talk about what had happened that night, but they could tell that something had deeply unsettled her. The wraith was no longer just a story to Rebecca. It was real, and its presence at Battle Abbey was undeniable. As the days passed, Rebecca began to experience strange occurrences throughout the Abbey. Doors would creak open on their own, shadows would flicker across the walls, and cold drafts would sweep through the corridors, even on the warmest days. The sense of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive, until Rebecca could no longer ignore it. One afternoon, as she worked in the old tower, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and echoing through the stairwell. Her heart raced as she turned toward the stairs, half expecting the wraith to appear once more. But this time it was not the wraith she saw. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, dressed in the robes of a monk. His face was hidden in shadow, but Rebecca could see the outline of his body, his hands clasped in front of him as though in prayer. The figure did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her in silence. Rebecca's blood ran cold. The monks who had once lived at Battle Abbey were long dead, their spirits said to haunt the Abbey along with the wraith. But she had never believed the stories until now. The monk turned and began to ascend the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of the upper chamber. Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what she had just seen. The wraith was not alone at Battle Abbey. The spirits of the monks were still there, still watching, still bound to the place where they had lived and died. By the time winter returned to Battle Abbey, Rebecca knew that she could no longer ignore the haunting. The wraith had appeared to her twice, and the presence of the monks had only confirmed what she had long feared. The spirits of the Abbey were trapped, their restless souls bound to the place where they had met their end. One cold evening, as the wind howled through the ancient stone walls, Rebecca made a decision. She would return to the tower one last time, confront the wraith, and attempt to understand why it haunted Battle Abbey. She climbed the narrow stone steps, her heart pounding with fear and determination. The air grew colder as she ascended, the temperature dropping with each step. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, and the sense of being watched grew stronger with every moment. When she reached the top of the stairs, she found the wraith waiting for her. It stood in the center of the chamber, its dark cloak billowing softly in the wind. The hood obscured its face, but Rebecca could feel the wraith's gaze upon her, burning with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she stepped forward. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cold, still air. "Why are you still here?" The wraith did not answer. It remained motionless, its form flickering like a shadow. But in that moment, Rebecca understood. The wraith was not here to harm her. It was not a malevolent spirit, but a lost soul, bound to Battle Abbey by a curse that had lasted for centuries. It had once been a soldier, a man who had fought and died in the battle that had shaped England's future, but his soul had never found peace. Rebecca took another step forward, her fear giving way to a deep sense of compassion. "You don't have to stay here," she said softly. "You can let go. You can find peace." For a long moment, the wraith stood silent. Then slowly, it lowered its hood. Rebecca gasped. The face beneath the hood was not the skeletal visage she had expected, but the face of a young man, pale, gaunt, and filled with sorrow. His eyes, once hollow and glowing, were now filled with a deep sadness, as though he had been trapped in his own personal hell for centuries. The wraith looked at her for a long moment, and then, with a final graceful motion, it began to fade. As the wraith disappeared into the shadows, the cold air in the tower began to lift. The oppressive weight that had hung over Battle Abbey for so long seemed to dissipate, and for the first time in centuries, the abbey felt truly at peace. Rebecca left Battle Abbey not long after that night. She had uncovered more than just the history of the abbey. She had uncovered the truth behind its most terrifying legend. The wraith was not a monster, but a man, a soldier whose spirit had been trapped by the violence of the past. In the years that followed, the sightings of the wraith became less frequent. The cold drafts, the flickering shadows, and the eerie presence that had haunted the abbey for so long seemed to fade away, as though the spirits had finally found peace. But the legend of the wraith of Battle Abbey lives on. Visitors to the abbey still speak of strange occurrences, of shadowy figures glimpsed in the corners of their vision, and of the cold, unsettling feeling that something or someone is watching them. Perhaps the wraith is still there, lingering at the edges of the abbey's history, waiting for someone to remember him, to acknowledge the sacrifice he made on that blood-soaked field so many centuries ago. The wraith may be gone, but Battle Abbey will always be a place where the past and the present collide, where the echoes of history still resonate in the stone walls and shadowy halls. The wraith of Battle Abbey is more than just a ghost story. It is a reminder of the human cost of history, of the lives lost, and the souls trapped by the violence of the past. For centuries, the wraith haunted the grounds of the abbey, a silent witness to the bloodshed that had once stained the land. But in the end, even the most restless of spirits can find peace. And yet, Battle Abbey remains a place of mystery and legend, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thinner than most. For those who walk its halls at night, the wraith may still be watching, waiting for the day when his story is finally laid to rest. Story 4, The Spectre of King Harold. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and the beginning of Norman dominance. For King Harold II, the final Anglo-Saxon king of England, the battle was not only a personal tragedy, but also a pivotal moment in history. Harold's army, exhausted from its march south after defeating a Viking invasion in the north, was overwhelmed by William the Conqueror's Norman forces. After hours of brutal fighting on Senlac Hill, Harold was killed according to legend, struck down by an arrow through the eye. It is said that Harold's body was mutilated after his death, his face unrecognizable. Though some accounts claim his mother identified him by a mark on his body, others believe his remains were never recovered. Harold's spirit, unable to find peace, is said to still roam the battlefield, forever tied to the land where he lost his crown, his life, and his kingdom. For centuries, locals and visitors to Hastings have spoken of strange sightings. An armored figure standing silently at the crest of Senlac Hill, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as though watching for an enemy that will never arrive. His spectral presence is most often seen at twilight, when the sun dips below the horizon and the air grows thick with the weight of history. One of the most chilling accounts of an encounter with Harold's ghost comes from the mid-20th century, when a historian named James Fuller visited the battlefield as part of his research into the life and death of the last Saxon king. James Fuller was a historian dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of early English history. His particular interest lay in the Anglo-Saxon period and the dramatic events that led to its demise with the Norman conquest. As a boy, James had been captivated by the story of King Harold, imagining the final, desperate moments of the battle when the Saxon king had fallen, signaling the end of an era. By 1954, James had published several academic works on the subject of Harold's reign and the Battle of Hastings, but there was still one mystery that lingered in his mind: the whereabouts of Harold's body. The traditional story claimed that Harold was buried at Waltham Abbey, but conflicting reports suggested his body was never found, or that it had been secretly removed from the battlefield. Determined to explore the historical and supernatural aspects of Harold's final moments, James made the journey to Hastings to visit the battlefield firsthand. He wanted to walk the ground where Harold had fought and died, to feel the weight of history beneath his feet, and perhaps to sense the lingering presence of the last Saxon king. It was late October when James arrived at the site of the battle. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees had turned shades of red and gold. Senlac Hill stood tall, its slopes covered in grass, the memory of the battle long faded, but the significance of the place ever present. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the landscape, James felt a deep sense of reverence for the events that had taken place there nearly 1,000 years ago. He stood at the crest of the hill, where Harold's forces had made their final stand, and gazed out over the rolling fields below. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The air grew colder, and a strange stillness settled over the battlefield. That's when James saw him. At first, James thought he was seeing things a trick of the light, perhaps, or his imagination playing tricks on him after a long day of exploring the battlefield. But as he squinted into the fading light, he realized that the figure standing at the far end of the hill was real. The figure was dressed in the armor of an Anglo-Saxon warrior, his helmet glinting faintly in the last rays of sunlight. He stood motionless, his back to James, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The figure's posture was rigid, as though he were standing guard, waiting for something. James felt a chill creep down his spine. He knew the stories of Harold's ghost, but he had never given much credence to them. And yet, there he was standing just a few yards away, his form solid and real against the backdrop of the darkening sky. For a long moment, James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure did not move. He remained still, his hands resting on the hilt of a sword that hung at his side. "Harold?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure remained silent, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his helmet. James took a cautious step forward, his mind racing. Could it really be him? Could the spirit of the last Saxon king still be here, tied to the battlefield where he had met his end? As James drew closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The figure's right eye was obscured by the shaft of an arrow, the wooden shaft protruding from his helmet at an unnatural angle. James gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. The stories were true. Harold had been killed by an arrow through the eye, and now, centuries later, his spirit still bore the mark of that fatal wound. The figure began to turn, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, James thought he would see Harold's face. But before the king could fully turn toward him, the figure faded, dissolving into the twilight like a wisp of smoke. James stood alone on the battlefield, the cold wind whipping through the grass, his heart pounding in his chest. The sun had fully set, and darkness was creeping over the land. He felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as though he had witnessed not just the ghost of a man, but the ghost of an entire era, an era that had died with Harold on that fateful day in 1066. The encounter left James shaken, but also deeply intrigued. He had come to Hastings in search of history, and instead, he had found something far more mysterious. Harold's ghost was real, and now James was determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting. Over the next several days, James threw himself into research. He scoured the archives in nearby towns, speaking with local historians, monks, and anyone who might have knowledge of the legends surrounding Harold's death. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. According to one ancient text, Harold's body had never been recovered from the battlefield. Though some claimed he was buried at Waltham Abbey, others believed his remains had been secretly hidden by his loyal followers. perhaps even buried in an unmarked grave on Senlac Hill itself. If Harold's body had been left unburied, or if he had been denied a proper burial, it could explain why his spirit still lingered, trapped between worlds. But there was more to the story. One local legend claimed that Harold had not died at Hastings at all. According to this tale, he had survived the battle, grievously wounded, and had been taken by his loyalists to a secret location, where he lived out the rest of his days in hiding. Some believed he had taken the name of a hermit and died years later in obscurity, his true identity kept hidden until the end. James was skeptical of these more fantastical claims, but he couldn't deny the possibility that something had gone terribly wrong in Harold's final moments. Could it be that the king's soul was trapped, unable to rest because of the mystery surrounding his death and burial? Determined to find answers, James decided to return to the battlefield at dusk, the same time he had seen the ghostly figure before. This time, he would come prepared not just with his historical knowledge, but with the hope of making contact with Harold's spirit once more. On the evening of his second attempt, the weather had turned colder. A biting wind swept across the battlefield, and the sun sank beneath the horizon in a blaze of orange and red. James stood at the crest of Senlac Hill once again, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The land was eerily silent. No birds called out, no animals stirred in the underbrush. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. James felt a shiver run down his spine as he stared out over the darkening fields. He had come here to make contact with Harold's ghost, to try to understand why the king's spirit was still tied to this place. But as the shadows lengthened, a deeper sense of dread began to creep into his thoughts. What if Harold's ghost was not here to communicate, but to warn? The wind picked up, and the air grew even colder. James wrapped his coat tighter around himself, his breath visible in the crisp night air. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the spectral figure he had seen before. And then, as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, he saw it. The figure stood at the far end of the hill, just as before. But this time, there was something different about him. He was closer now, his form more defined in the dim light. The arrow still jutted from his helmet, a grotesque reminder of his death. But his posture was different, less rigid, more deliberate. James felt his pulse quicken. The ghost was moving toward him. As the figure drew closer, James felt a growing sense of unease. There was something unsettling about the way the ghost moved, slow, deliberate, as though it were making a conscious effort to be seen. Its armor clinked softly with each step, the metal dull and tarnished, worn by centuries of decay. James stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come here to find answers, and now, it seemed, the answers were coming to him. But as the ghostly figure approached, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by something far older, far more powerful than just a restless spirit. When the ghost was only a few yards away, it stopped. The air grew colder still, and James could see his breath condensing in the frigid air. The figure stood silent, its face obscured by the shadow of its helmet. "Harold," James whispered, his voice trembling. The figure remained motionless, its gaze fixed on the horizon. James swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had to make contact, had to understand why the spirit was still here. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What do you want?" For a moment there was no response. The wind howled through the trees, and the shadows deepened around them. And then, slowly, the figure began to turn its head. James's heart skipped a beat as the ghost turned to face him fully. The arrow in its eye socket was still there, the shaft splintered and bloodless. But it was the face beneath the helmet that chilled James to the core. It was Harold's face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. His expression was one of deep sorrow, as though the weight of centuries had pressed down on him, trapping him in an endless loop of grief and regret. For a long, terrible moment, the ghost of King Harold stared at James. Its eyes filled with a haunting sadness that made James's heart ache. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, the ghost spoke. "Lost," the ghost said, its voice faint and hollow, like the wind blowing through a graveyard. "I am lost." James felt a shiver run down his spine. The voice was soft, almost fragile, but it carried with it the weight of centuries of suffering. He took a step closer, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Why are you still here?" James asked, his voice trembling. "Why can't you move on?" The ghost's eyes flickered, and for a moment, James thought he saw a glimmer of recognition in them. The king's face, pale and haggard, seemed to soften, as though he were remembering something from long ago. "I was betrayed," the ghost whispered, its voice barely audible. "I was forsaken." James's heart pounded in his chest. Betrayed? By whom? The history books told of Harold's defeat at the hands of William the Conqueror, but there was no mention of betrayal. Was the king speaking of something deeper, something more personal? Before James could ask another question, the ghost's expression hardened, and the cold air around them seemed to intensify. The wind picked up, whipping through the grass, and the shadows deepened around them. "I am bound to this place," the ghost said, its voice filled with bitterness. "My kingdom lost, my people slain, I cannot leave." James's heart ached for the king. He had been the last of his line, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, and his defeat at Hastings had marked the end of an era. But now, centuries later, his spirit was still trapped here, bound to the land where he had fallen. "Is there nothing I can do to help you?" James asked, his voice filled with compassion. For a long moment, the ghost was silent. Its eyes, hollow and sorrowful, flickered in the dim light, and then, slowly, it began to fade. As the ghost of King Harold disappeared into the night, James stood alone on the battlefield, the wind howling around him, the air thick with the weight of history. He had come here seeking answers, and while he had found some, there were still mysteries left unsolved. Had Harold truly been betrayed? Was his soul trapped here because of the mystery surrounding his death and burial? Or was it something deeper, something tied to the loss of his kingdom and the destruction of his people? James knew that he might never find the answers he sought, but one thing was clear: the spirit of King Harold was still here, bound to the land where he had fought and died. His soul, burdened by the weight of history and the loss of his kingdom, could not find peace. As James left the battlefield, the wind carried with it a final, faint whisper, one that echoed in his mind for years to come. Lost. The story of King Harold's ghost is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living, breathing thing, one that can leave scars on the land and the souls of those who lived through it. The specter of King Harold still roams the battlefield at Hastings, a ghostly reminder of the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of Norman rule. For those who visit Senlac Hill, the spirit of Harold may still be watching, his eyes filled with sorrow as he gazes out over the land he once ruled. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows lengthen, you might just hear his voice, calling out from the past, still searching for peace. The Battle of Hastings was a turning point in English history, but it was also a moment of immense loss and suffering. The stories of ghostly armies, wraiths, and fallen kings are a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that the echoes of history can still be heard, and the shadows of those who fought and died may still linger. Perhaps the next time you visit the battlefield at Hastings, you'll hear the faint sound of clashing swords, or catch a glimpse of a hooded figure in the ruins of Battle Abbey. Or maybe, if you listen closely, you'll hear the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the voices of the long-dead soldiers who fought for their king, their land, and their place in history. Do you have a tale of the supernatural to share? Perhaps you've encountered the shadows of history yourself. Tell your story, and let the ghosts of Hastings know they are not forgotten.